Well, Peter, do you want to say anything or
Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the second week of the winter lecture series for this year. Uh, for those of you who were here last week, welcome back, and for those of you who were not, welcome. This year's theme of the Global Perspectives Winter Lecture Series for 2025 is Envisioning a Resilient Future. Um, I'd like to remind everyone to be sure that your video is off and you are muted. And at a time after the talk, you'll be able to ask questions or make comments via the chat function. And if you would like to, you can unmute yourself, and you'll be able to speak live to the various participants and to the speaker. Uh, the the programs are being recorded. Last week's has been recorded, and they are available. They'll be available within a few days after each lecture on the YouTube channel of the Unitarian Church. Uh, so if you go to unitarianlincoln.org, you'll find information about the series. You can send that link to other people so they can join in the future sessions, and you can see the YouTube recordings of lectures that have already taken place. That is lectures and the follow-up questions and answers and discussion. Uh, Again, I'd like to remind people of one more thing, that after the 4 weeks of lectures, we do have a fifth week this year where there will be an in-person panel discussion of local people involved in a resilient future in Lincoln. That will be in person at the Unitarian Church in Lincoln at 6300 A Street at 3 o'clock on Sunday, March 16th. But it also will be available live on Zoom. So you're welcome to attend in person, and we always can generate an easier discussion in person. But if you're unable to or choose to watch it remotely, you can watch it the same way that you're watching this right now via Zoom. And we're using the same Zoom link for all 5 series. Uh, Without taking up any more of your time and leaving the time for the speaker, I'd like to introduce tonight's lecturer. Uh, he is Dr. Tim Crews, Crews. He's the chief scientist and international program director, and also director of ecological intensification at the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas. He will tell you a little bit more about his background and also tell you about the Land Institute, which is a unique nonprofit here on the Great Plains. His topic tonight is on regenerative agriculture, but I'll turn the program over to Tim so he can use all the available time. When he's finished, uh, Jason Slaughter, who's operating our computer and our Zoom operation, will be receiving your comments on chat, and he will read them out to you, to the speaker, and help us with that. So, without further ado, let me introduce to you Dr. Tim Crews.
All right? Well, thank you, Peter. And I want to thank Peter and Sherrod and Chuck Francis for the invitation to present this evening from Salina, Kansas, and to the other organizers. And thank you, Jason, for helping run the tech here. Seems to be working thus far. Um, I am going to share my screen right now and dive in. Okay. Yeah, so yeah, I was asked by Chuck to present on maybe something to do with regenerative agriculture, a topic that is um, understood to some extent these days. It's talked about a lot, and yet we have a little bit of a unique angle on regenerative agriculture, and it's summed up by the title that I gave this talk. If we want to regenerate, consider what generated in the first place. And let's see if I can move my slides. So did I just change slides? I just want to make sure I can't.
Yes, yes, you did.
Okay, good.
Tim,
Thank you.
can you tell us something about the Land Institute? Because many of the folks who are listening don't know what that is.
Yeah, I will. It's going to be described in parts through the talk. It's a nonprofit research organization. It's been around almost 50 years, a little bit longer than this talk series. And it's based in Salina, Kansas. Uh, and it was founded by Wes Jackson and Dana Jackson, his first wife, back in 76. And I, as an undergraduate at UC Santa Cruz, read New Roots for Agriculture in 1981. And my folks were living in Topeka at the time, and I came and visited. But I went to UC Santa Cruz because of reading Wendell Berry's book, The Unsettling of America, Culture and Agriculture, and was looking for an agricultural program, kind of alternative ag program at a university. And Santa Cruz had that to offer at the time. And so these two individuals have been very, very influential in what the trajectory of my vocation and career. But something that the Land Institute had as a organizing principle was that natural systems really had a lot to offer agriculture, that agriculture was challenged by many problems and still is, and that some of that could be traced back to where our food producing ecosystems differed from the rest of the ecosystems on planet Earth. And I want to dive into that a little bit here this evening, pointing out a couple of kind of basic ecology ideas that are a backstop or a background for thinking about agriculture and how we grow food and how we have been growing food for 10,000 years since the beginning of agriculture. This robin and every other living creature on the planet, maybe except humans right now, have something that ecologists talk about, and that is kind of they operate on an optimal foraging approach. And that is the food that they go get delivers more energy to them than they spend getting the food. Okay, so that worm has more calories given to that robin than the robin spent in going to find it and pull it out of the ground, at least on balance over the course of a day or a week or a month. All organisms have to obtain more energy than they expend getting their food, or they die. It's like a simple thermodynamic principle. So that's one, optimal foraging. Another ecological kind of almost law, but certainly a commonality amongst almost all land-based ecosystems on the planet is that the vegetation is comprised of diverse perennials. This is a high altitude coniferous forest, a tropical rainforest, a desert, and a grassland. Overwhelmingly, the vegetation you see is perennial and it's diverse. Recently, there was a paper in Nature that inventoried the total species on the planet of plants, and they reported that only 6% of all plants on Earth are annuals, and the rest are perennial. And by perennial, we mean They live for more than 1 year, oftentimes many years. They might be woody, they might be herbaceous or like grasses, but they live for more than 1 year. Now, there's an important place for annual plants in natural ecosystems. When there is like a catastrophic disturbance in a natural ecosystem, like a very, very intense fire that kills everything, it's fantastic that there are annuals, maybe in the seed bank or blow in, that are quick to germinate. They hold the soil, they'll grow and really protect the environment, preventing a lot of soil erosion and leaching of nutrients. But eventually, and oftentimes just within years, perennials outcompete the annuals and take over. And at that point, you have pretty much solid stands of perennials once again. So at any one point in time in more natural ecosystems on Earth, the vegetation is just overwhelmingly perennial and diverse again. And it's not just above ground where the action is. In fact, a lot of what makes perennials make sense in ecology is what's going on below ground. I just wanted to point out a couple of features to illustrate what I'm talking about. This is a soil profile of a prairie. And what we have here is there's one little end fixer. There's a legume nested in that vegetation. And the legume has roots with little tumor-like nodules on it that house bacteria that are able to use nitrogen from the atmosphere, the gas. Most of the atmosphere we breathe is nitrogen, almost 80%. And the bacteria are able to break a bond in that nitrogen gas and make it available to the plant. And then when that plant dies at the end of the growing season and decomposes, the nitrogen goes into the soil and other plants around benefit. And it's this nitrogen coupled with the nitrogen from lightning and some other bacteria in the soil that supplies this essential nutrient, the nutrient that we apply the most of in agriculture, to this very productive prairie. But it's very slight. It's just a trace amount coming in. And so what happens in the prairie and most natural ecosystems like forests and savannas, tundra, is that they build up, the ecosystem builds up a pool of nitrogen, of decomposing organic matter, and then the plants take it back up, they grow, they die, decompose, and that nitrogen is cycled over and over again. And I know that this N means something different up where you guys are, but it also means nitrogen and it cycles. That is one of kind of nature's law, is recycling. And then look over here. There's a biopore. This is where there was a plant growing and it died, where the root was decomposed. And it's this kind of structure in the soil that allows rain to penetrate in, or snowmelt to penetrate into the soil deeply, so that later in the growing season, these roots can tap that stored moisture and grow a prairie, even when there's no rainfall for 1 or 2 or 3 weeks. So the soil structure is really important in helping the ecosystem function. Another example of that, oh, well, there's many examples of what I'm talking about. I just pointed out two, but I'm gonna grab one more, and that is this buildup of soil organic matter. You can see this really dark top profile, the topsoil of this prairie soil. This is a soil called a mollisol in the U.S. Department of Agriculture nomenclature. And it's dark because of the dead roots that die and decompose. They deposit this soil organic matter and it accumulates. But one of the reasons you get so much of it in this prairie soil is that you have a lot of roots from this prairie vegetation depositing carbon, and the roots, the plant matter is made up of a lot of carbon into the ground. So you have high roots, high root to shoot ratio. There's a lot of roots compared to how much shoot matter there is, which is the above ground vegetation. That and then soil organic matter is also linked to these fungi, mycorrhizal fungi. Some of you might have heard about them. They proliferate and infect most of the plant roots here, and they trade nutrients for sugars from these plants. But in the process, they make kind of a glue structure, and that helps form these aggregates. And the aggregates, these little blocky kind of chunks that you see, hold on to soil organic matter. It's just a really important part of why these soils are fertile and also understanding regenerative agriculture, because soil organic matter is kind of the holy grail of, of regenerative agriculture. And finally, when you put all of these processes we're seeing here together, something that happens that is just critical for resilience and sustainability is that soil formation exceeds soil loss. You have more of this organic matter accumulating, more mineral matter from down here turning into fertile soil, than you're losing through erosion in particular, because you have such a thick mat of vegetation protecting the soil from intense wind and rain. It's fascinating to me to see in regenerative agriculture, soil health principles become established that basically describe the natural ecosystem that is here. The four soil health principles of the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service of the USDA, are maximize continuous living roots, minimize disturbance, maximize soil cover, and maximize biodiversity. That is this ecosystem right here. This is Konza Prairie over by Manhattan. And yet these soil health principles are put forward by NRCS to inspire and inform farmers up and down the Great Plains and elsewhere. And so we're going to find out here that it's actually pretty tricky to implement soil health principles in annual cropping systems for reasons that we'll see. In contrast to the ecosystems I just described, annual grain agroecosystems, wheat, corn, soy, by grains, I mean cereals, which is like rye and wheat and rice, the grasses. But grains also refer to legume seeds or pulses like soy or lentils or chickpeas, different beans, and also oilseed crops like sunflower and safflower oil, things like that. All of those are annuals, and in order to grow annuals, you have to kill the competing vegetation every year. You knock it back with plows, typically globally. More recently, especially in the US and in Australia, Brazil, herbicides will be used also to knock back the competing vegetation. But essentially, you're needing to kill all the plants on the landscape in order to establish your annual crop. And with that comes some pretty profound implications. One is that more often than not, and this is a global study, you lose more soil than is being formed. I was just talking at the end of the series of slides of that soil profile that, yeah, you have more soil formation than soil loss. Well, once you remove all of the vegetation across the landscape on an annual basis, generally you start to lose more soil than is being formed. And in this case, the global median is over 300 times more soil loss than is being formed in tilled agriculture, but still on the order of 16 times the soil loss in no-till compared to the native ecosystem or more. And so just, boy, in terms of sustainability, whenever you're losing more soil, losing more of the means of production than you're gaining, it's like the definition of not being sustainable. There are some landscapes, though, that are not as vulnerable to erosion. And yet, those landscapes are almost certainly losing soil carbon or soil organic matter. Soil organic matter is made up of 58% carbon, and they're often used interchangeably, carbon and organic matter. And this figure here shows on the y-axis is soil organic matter remaining, and this is years of cultivation on the x-axis. So when the prairie, for example, was first plowed, it had almost 100% of its potential soil organic matter that had accumulated over hundreds, if not thousands of years under prairie roots with minimal disturbance. But once you start plowing that soil, you start to lose a substantial amount of the soil organic matter or carbon that it contained, that dark topsoil. And these two sites, one in Russell, Nebraska, and one in Alberta, Canada, this brackets the typical range of loss that soils will have after decades of being tilled or cultivated. And the reason this happens, I was mentioning the aggregates. These aggregates or clods contain protected organic matter. But as soon as you break them open with a some tillage instrument, a disc or a plow, it exposes that protected organic matter to microbes, to bacteria, to fungi, and other organisms, and they chow down on the soil organic matter for energy. And just like us, they breathe out carbon dioxide. And so you have a huge plume of carbon leaving recently tilled soils because of that enhanced microbial activity, eating it and breathing out carbon. And then the flip side is that we will replace the prairie, temperate grassland that allocates on the order of 40 to 60% of its sugars, of its carbon below ground in these roots, compared to annual crops that we replace the perennial vegetation which only allocates on the order of 15 to 25% of its productivity below ground. So between losing more because of microbial respiration and adding less because you've substituted annual roots for perennial roots, organic matter plummets, typically in agricultural soils. This is a very wordy slide, but from this amazing article by DeLuca and Zembinski, they pointed out that the combined carbon losses from tall, mixed, and shortgrass prairies likely released nearly 5 petagrams of carbon. I know that's a huge number, hard to imagine, but it's a magnitude roughly similar to the sea losses associated with the deforestation of the Brazilian Amazon forests. This happened at the time when the prairie was first being converted into vast areas of tilled agriculture. Now, historical carbon dioxide emissions look something like this. These are global, and this blue is the ongoing conversion of lands, like I just described with the prairie, into agriculture or urban use, but most of it is agriculture. And you can see it was dominant. It was the main source of CO2 enrichment into the atmosphere up until, 1930. It was matched by fossil fuel use. And now fossil fuel has just overwhelmed land conversion as a percent of total human caused CO2 enrichment of the atmosphere. Another thing that happens with tilled ground like this, and where you eliminate all the vegetation, meaning all the roots and thus root uptake of nutrients every year, is that you lose a lot of the applied fertility, whether it's synthetic nitrogen or manure. If you don't have roots in the ground, you tend to lose about half of the nutrients applied. And that's almost always the case with synthetic nutrients. You have to put the fertilizers out in grain fields before the crop establishes and closes canopy. And by definition, that tends to mean that you have a lot of vulnerability of the nitrogen moving around. And so you get nitrate leaching, but you also get gases leaving, with nitrous oxide being a very potent greenhouse gas. So those are some of the ecological shortcomings of removing the landscape's vegetation on an annual basis to plant annual crops. I do want to shift our attention, though, to a topic that doesn't receive nearly as much attention in kind of the ecosystem services realm, but is really critical as we're grappling with climate change and our dependency on fossil fuels, especially for the production of our food. This is a landscape in Africa, and it is a savanna with these are legume trees. And when you by hand, in many cases, as the agriculture continues to be in parts, this is in Burkina Faso in particular, when that landscape is converted to annual crops, it requires a lot of work. I have the header up here. Why does annual agriculture require so much work? Well, in ecological terms, we're holding the ecosystem, we're arresting it at a very early stage of what's called succession. It's basically, it's like a landslide or a river floodplain. It's a huge amount of energy to hold back what we see in the top picture, which is the vegetation that would naturally develop. To prevent that from happening, humans for 10,000 years have spent a tremendous amount of their lives killing vegetation. And there's that's one reason why agriculture is so much work is we need to maintain that ecosystem at the bottom. But another is that it requires a lot of work to compensate for poor ecosystem function. When you disrupt the soil and get rid of the biopores and break up the aggregates and don't allow for mycorrhizal fungi to proliferate over time, a lot of the details that I was showing in those first slides are disrupted by the level of disturbance that we have to implement in order to maintain annual production. And with that comes some inferior functions. The ecosystem, it requires more human inputs, human labor inputs, and resources to grow your crop than the ecosystem in the top of this photo. Now, bear with me for just a few minutes if you don't, I don't know if you like graphs. This one helps understand where we are in a way that is 1,000 words. But hopefully, we'll get through this. And if your eyes are glazing over, it's only going to last a couple of minutes, okay? But basically, what we have down here on the x-axis is yield, kilograms or pounds per acre. It's how much food is produced in that farm. And then on the y-axis is what we call energy return on investment. And it's basically what I was talking about with the robin in that very first slide, which is how much energy do you get back for the work you spend growing food? And what happens is that when farmers would first arrive in a place and the crop wasn't particularly adapted yet to that place, and the farmers didn't know the details of trying to produce food on that soil with that amount of rainfall. Basically, we know that the energy return on investment, they maybe got 5 calories back for every calorie they spent working. Okay. But as the germplasm or the seeds, as the plants they were growing adapted to the region through cycles of selection, and as they figured out, hey, oh, those trees, those are legumes. They fix nitrogen. We're going to plant them alongside the rows of these fields. And when we plant these two plants together, they both do really well together. Once farmers figured out a lot of traditional knowledge growing in a particular environment over years, generally you would get an increase of energy return on investment. And this David Pimentel had found that on the order of 10 to 40 calories of food were grown for every 1 calorie of energy spent by a farmer in many of the world's traditional farming systems. Again, this is all before fossil fuels. You had to get more energy back than you spent growing the food, or you would not live to the next growing season. So that would happen. And when farmers were in a place for dozens to hundreds of years, oftentimes traditional farming methods, indigenous farming methods became very sophisticated and were able to utilize resources and different kind of ecological interactions to produce food with a lot of energy return on investment. Okay. It was that additional energy grown by the farmers that supports all of the activities that are not agriculture. So you have a high, if you get 40 calories back for every 1 calorie the farmer expends, then there's 39 calories for other people to do other things with, such as religion. War is something that requires a lot of energy and does not produce energy. Music. Infants are growing, they're not farming, and so they need to live off of this additional energy returned on investment. All right, so I'm going to leave this glorious figure now and say that in 1859, as a marker, that's when the first oil well was drilled in the world in Titusville, Pennsylvania. But gradually, as fossil fuels started to take hold around this time, everything changed. It changed in how we live our lives in so many ways, but agriculture is no different. And if you don't take any other number home tonight, this one is easy to remember. And it just underscores the power of fossil fuels. And that is that 1 gallon of gas contains the equivalent amount of work energy as a human expends in 100 hours of labor. Now, you can't just readily convert a gallon of gas to labor, but we're very ingenious at figuring out technologies for converting the energy in this to accomplish tasks that humans otherwise would have done. In addition to all sorts of industrial procedures that will allow for plants to grow better. For example, nitrogen is the most energy expensive input into modern agriculture. But you can see how you're like, okay, wow, compared to 2.5 40-hour work weeks, if there was a minimum wage of $15 an hour, that's $1,500 versus $3. Let's see. That's a hard decision, right? This explains in very simple terms why we have gone down the path that we have. And in fact, we consume as US citizens globally anyway, I mean, as a whole, if you take the total commercial energy provided by fossil fuels in the United States and divide it by the population, there is the equivalent energy expended of 80 people per person working 10 hours per day, 365 days per year to maintain the life that we live. Now, this is an illustration obviously fraught with impossibilities because it includes things like plastic bags and running an air conditioner and things that humans don't do. But it at least translates the energetic dependency that this lifestyle has on fossil fuels and puts it in kind of human terms. And a lot of what we spend fossil fuels on could have been or was accomplished through metabolic muscle energy. And in agriculture, we have used fossil fuels to relax or eliminate every ecological limiting factor virtually to crop production. Insect pests, pesticides, weed competition, tillage or herbicides, disease, we have fungicides, water limitation, irrigation, nutrient limitation, fertilizers, temperature. We have greenhouses and road covers and shade cloths. It is amazing the degree to which we have been able to use fossil energy to address almost everything that limits plant growth in agriculture. And because of that, we've arrived at a place where growing maize, traditionally, such as would happen in south central Mexico, where maize was domesticated, less than 1% of the energy expended to grow the maize was derived from a fossil fuel of any type. And this was not that long ago, even. Whereas today in Iowa, almost 100%, 99.96% of the energy input to grow maize is derived from fossil fuels. Another way to appreciate that number is from this recent IFAD report, in which they were comparing the labor productivity, and by that it means like how much food is produced per hour of work by a farmer. If you took all the hours at the end of the growing season, a smallholder Kenyan farmer spent growing the maize crop, and you divided the yield by that number of hours, how many kilograms, and a kilogram is 2.2 pounds of maize did you get per hour? And in Kenya, that smallholder would be every hour they worked, they would be equivalent growing 1.2 kilograms. In Iowa, an hour of work is 1,470 kilograms of maize. Now, is that Iowa farmer working that much harder? I don't think so. It's that Iowa farmer is in a cab of a very, very large tractor. And so this just it reflects the energy input into US maize production, compensating for all of this metabolic work that takes place in smallholder farmers around the world. Now, I'm not advocating for the type of labor that this Kenyan farmer is having to do. We saw pictures of it. It's extremely laborious. It defines us as a species for 10,000 years, having to do that work. And so we're trying to think for other ways to grow food. In essence, what we've done back to this figure is we've left the highly developed solar-based agriculture. And with a fossil fuel intensive agriculture, we're able to grow far greater yields. But the energy return on investment has plummeted. And the input is fossil fuel, not solar energy in the food itself. Because in traditional agriculture, the energy was from the food. That was what powered the farmer. And now we've decoupled our source of energy to get our food. We're the only animal, as far as I know, on the planet that has pulled this off ever, where it doesn't matter how much energy we spend to go get our food compared to how much we expend or require. We can spend a lot more energy getting our food than it gives us. And in fact, in some cases, we spend more energy getting food, like offshore fishing or tomatoes, things like this, than they actually give us back in calories. So at the Land Institute, what we're proposing is that what if we move our very disturbance-based ecosystem down this successional gradient and in agriculture accomplish all of these ecological functions that do exist in natural ecosystems, natural diverse perennial systems, soil formation, carbon accumulation, nutrient retention, weed suppression, soil water capture and utilization, and low fossil fuel dependency in agriculture. And so in order to do that, though, we often joke, we need new hardware. Lee DeHaan, who is the lead Kernza breeder, came up with this slide. It's a laptop computer with very dated hardware. And the idea is regenerative agriculture can be accomplished with annuals, but it's kind of like this in terms of the challenge of making it work. And if we can develop perennial hardware in agriculture, then we can come a lot closer to mimicking the structure and function of a natural ecosystem. It is these plants, or the lack of them, that is holding us from achieving that. And so we're developing perennial grain crops. There's two ways that we're doing it and colleagues around the world. One is through crossing already existing annual crops with perennial relatives. And this is happening with wheat, with sorghum. This is the perennial sorghum root. It's a rhizome. And it's happened famously now with rice. Rice is actually the most the most successful of the perennial crops in general, and certainly in terms of wide hybridization. This is a perennial rice that was bred by crossing an already existing annual rice that had high yields with a perennial cousin from Africa, Longus staminata. And what they've achieved is a rice that yields the same for up to 8 harvests in a row, the same as the annual rice that it replaced. And it's 2 harvests per year over 4 years. It got a lot of attention in 2022 when this article came out in Nature Sustainability. And with that, Science magazine uh, awarded it one of the top 12 breakthroughs in science in the year 2022. So it was a big deal for the research group in the Yunnan province of China, a group that we've worked closely with over the last 15 years. And they're continuing to move forward with the new varieties, a basmati, and importantly, an upland perennial rice to prevent some pretty drastic soil erosion that happens on steep topography in Southeast Asia. The other approach that we're taking to develop perennial grain crops is through de novo domestication, meaning we're domesticating wild species and selecting on those wild species, just like people did 5 to 10,000 years ago with all of our current grain crops, choosing the individuals that have the traits or the features like high seed yield and not dropping your seed at the end of the year, and then growing those out, allowing them to cross pollinate, selecting from those populations, regrowing them. And it's we're making progress. You may have heard of Kernza. Kernza is a relative of wheat or intermediate wheatgrass. And here you can see the root system. These are grown in tubes of Kernza across 4 seasons of the year next to annual wheat. And so in September, with winter wheat, there's no roots in the ground, as we know, with annual wheat. In December, there's a few in March, and it's only in June when you have the full stature of below ground roots in place for a period of time. And yet you can see why the perennial crop does not leak very many nutrients and adds a lot of soil carbon and protects the soil compared to the annual. Here's a side-by-side view of the roots of wheat in a soil profile next to Kernza. Um, and there is a lot of biological activity going on and carbon accumulation in the root zone of the Kernza here. This is just a bar diagram comparing annual wheat root biomass next to the Kernza in a organic system, a low N and a high N farming arrangement by Christine Sprunger at her work in University of Michigan, or Michigan State rather. This is what a breeding nursery of Kernza used to look like, where we would plant out on the order of 25,000 individual unique crosses and go through, have interns, and other researchers go through and literally examine every single one, harvest each one individually, weigh the seed, photograph the seed, and find the best ones and then do it again. And it would take 2 to 3 years per breeding cycle. Very, very slow. This still happens on a certain level, but to a much reduced degree because we are now employing some fairly advanced genetic tools. This is called genomic selection, where you use markers in the plant's DNA to tell you if it has some of the traits that you're interested in. There's this one, non-shattering, not dropping your seed at the end of the year, a key domestication trait that all the grains that have ever been domesticated were selected for because we want to eat that seed. It shouldn't drop on the ground. And so you can take a piece of leaf after a Kernza seedling sprouts, send it to K-State. They do a partial sequencing of the genes and tell us, yes, this plant does have this disease resistance, or at least it's correlated with disease resistance. It has non-shattering. It might be missing other traits that we're interested in, but Lee will decide which of these 10,000 plants stays in the breeding population and then gets planted out, cross-pollinated, and advanced that way. In this, we are actually able to have 2 cycles of genomic selection per year, but we also do have kind of truthing populations that get planted out to make sure that, in fact, these selection models are working. It's so slow to domesticate a new crop this in the modern era. Back when we did it as humans 9,000 years ago, we didn't even know what we were doing, and there was nothing better that it was trying to replace. So the patience required to develop a new crop, it will take 20 to 30 years per crop, even with this type of genomic selection accelerating the work. But this is an approach. It's not transgenics. We're simply passively looking at the DNA to understand, to help with the phenotype or the appearance of the plant to help make the selections. Other domestication projects we're working on are silphium, this oilseed crop, which has been selected because of its incredibly deep root and drought tolerance. Sainfoin is a legume that produces a bean that's sort of like a lentil. It can be a dual use forage and a lentil crop or a plant protein crop. And it's a brilliant source of nectar for pollinators. And so it has another service, as does silphium. But as mentioned earlier, we're not just interested in replacing a monoculture on the landscape in agriculture with a perennial monoculture. Having the new hardware allows us to actually create entirely different cropping ecosystems that really do start to approach the function of something like the prairie. In this instance, we would plant Kernza and alfalfa in at the same time in rows. We learned a lot in doing this, as have others who have intercropped Kernza with a legume like alfalfa or clovers. But one thing we learned is that you really need to have the legume run ahead of the cereal to make the nitrogen puzzle work out. And so in this case, we have been planting alfalfa for 2 to 3 years, harvesting it as a viable commercial crop. And that loads a lot of fertility into the ground. That alfalfa, it's a legume, heavy nitrogen fixer. And then undercut strips in the alfalfa and plant Kernza. And we have had 4 years of very productive Kernza, no fertilizer. In fact, the soil has gotten more fertile with nitrogen over the period of time that the Kernza has been in the ground. Very, very few weeds. It's kind of a remarkable farming system, one that is growing itself to a much greater extent than anything where you have to till, have tractor passes, weed, fertilize. Again, it just shows what may be possible in the future with these kinds of perennial cropping arrangements. It's very exciting. So back last one of these, essentially what we're doing is removing the cap on the top of this curve because when you don't have to make tractor passes, when you don't have to go work to accumulate the nitrogen or pay for synthetic nitrogen, which is very energetically expensive, when you're not having to do all of these things, you have a lot more return in food calories for the effort, more higher energy return on investment than anything that would be achievable in an annual cropping system that required all of the labor and resource inputs. This is what we're striving for. And lately, wrapping it up, there's been some really appreciated acknowledgement of the uh, rationale for a natural systems agriculture like what I'm describing. Just on the 14th of January, this was announced that more than 150 Nobel and World Food Prize laureates issued an unprecedented wake-up call over hunger tipping points. And it's a really interesting letter. You can look it up online. But in it, they identified seven what they were calling moonshot ideas that were well worth trying because of the impact they would have on alleviating hunger. And part of that alleviation of hunger is in resilience and ecological sustainability. And two of the seven that they listed are transformation of annual to perennial crops and innovations in diverse cropping systems. Two of the core elements that the Land Institute's work is based on that we acknowledge exist in naturally almost all natural ecosystems on land and are trying to bring those into agriculture. The international initiative that I've been fortunate enough to direct the last couple of years is geared to expand and accelerate and diversify the development of natural systems agriculture by promoting, facilitating, and supporting the expansion of research on perennial grains around the world. We have quite a few colleagues, and the list is growing every week in terms of the individuals working in a lab somewhere in the world advancing an aspect of perennial grains. Plant breeding is paramount, but there's also agronomy, crop protection ecology, social adoption, soil ecology. All of these areas are really critical, and it's very exciting to see so many people from different cultural backgrounds taking an interest in this work. I put up this Scandinavian hub. We have what we call hubs because it probably is the most developed of all of them. And you can see the different institutions that have come together. Many of these groups are writing research proposals and planning shared research projects to advance a lot of Kernza, but also barley is a crop that is being worked on in Scandinavia that we are not working on at the Land Institute. And it's very exciting to see. Finally, I mentioned a meeting that is coming up at Summit, north of Mexico City, near Texcoco. Simon is very famous in the plant breeding world because it is the site where the Green Revolution took place. Norman Borlaug developed high yielding dwarf wheat at Summit. He wasn't based in this central campus north of Mexico City. He was in Obregon in northern Mexico. But Summit has been known for its role in the Green Revolution, and many people might think it's incongruous for the Land Institute and Summit to be co-hosting a meeting. And in many respects, we were quite a bit more distant as two institutions just 10 years ago. But the whole CGAR system, which is a network of plant breeding, open source plant breeding international institutions around the world, dedicated to improving smallholder agriculture in the global south in particular, they've shifted towards being very open-minded, partly because of the soil degradation and challenges that we're facing, like the Nobel laureate and food prize laureates letter suggested, and are very interested now because of methods like genomic selection and how we might be able to move into some perennial cropping systems that really, really deliver a level of food security and resilience that may not exist in annual cropping systems. And so researchers at CIMMYT have gladly welcomed co-hosting a meeting that will be taking place in 2 weeks just north of Mexico City with about 120 researchers from 30 countries around the world on perennial grains. So it's called Pathways to a Perennial Future. I'm very excited about that. So with that, I thank you so much for your attention. I'm sitting here staring at my computer screen talking, but I know there's people out there, and I'm about to see some faces as I stop share. And yeah, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to have some conversations. I've left a few things out to stimulate discussion if it's lagging at all, but I'm really interested in people's questions and thoughts. So thank you.
Well, we do have a couple questions already. We have Rosalind asking, is Kenza a gluten product plant?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is, and it's a relative of wheat. It doesn't have the same glutens as does wheat, which is unfortunate because if you're going to have glutens, you want to have, it'd be ideal to have the glutens that make bread rise well. There's some thought that the bread rising glutens are in intermediate wheatgrass and could be bred into Kernza, but right now that's not the primary goal of the breeding program. And so Kernza is being used for non-leaven products like crackers or pizza crusts, things like that. Also in a lot of beers. Patagonia Provisions has made quite a few beers or teamed up with other breweries. So no, the for those who are looking for gluten-free grains, Kernza is not the one you're after, but there is a perennial sorghum being developed, and barley as well. And in fact, we're teaming up with researchers in Bolivia to begin the work of developing a perennial quinoa also. And so that's very exciting.
Marvin Almy asked, are you growing your perennial crops as dryland crops or are they being irrigated?
Up until now, they've all been dry land, and that is where we lean. We're really not trying to develop. We're trying to develop crops that are alternatives to irrigated crops, especially over the Ogallala. However, in breeding these species, we do have some that have access to irrigation in case we need it to establish or save precious germplasm. We don't want to lose work. And so having irrigation on hand, either to assure that we have a population that establishes that we can do the work that year, or if we hit a really bad drought and the crop is threatened, then we will irrigate also. That's not to say that there are people who are interested in using irrigation, and most of these species do respond. But what we've also found is even in those circumstances, because these deep roots are able to access a larger volume of soil water, the amount of irrigation they require is typically considerably less than more shallow-rooted annual species. But yeah, it's a good question. We're generally striving for crops that minimize resource inputs, and so The fact that you have higher infiltration with perennials typically. If you have a perennial cover on the ground, you tend to, because of the biopores I talked about and just the soil structure in general, you tend to get higher infiltration. And then with really deep roots, you can go access that water for quite a bit longer. And so the need for irrigation goes down considerably. But the perennial crops need water. In fact, they need more water often than annual crops. They can get more water. But anyway, yeah, I probably going on with too many details there, but I think avoiding the requirement of irrigation is definitely a priority.
Earl K. and Mary S. ask, does Land Institute get federal funding? If so, what percent of the budget is federal?
That's a good question. Our total budget is around $10 million a year right now, and about a tenth of that is coming from federal agency grants at the moment. And so the majority of it is from philanthropic gifts, either from foundations or individuals. And yeah, but we've had good success with partnerships getting federal grants, and especially through FFAR. But there's a USDA large grant that's winding up, the Kernza Cap. Some of you may have heard of it. And there's a pretty large National Science Foundation grant also that we're a part of through the Danforth Center in St. Louis. But yeah, that's that, and that it's a mixed blessing. But right now, we're actually relieved that we're not relying more on those federal grants than many are, given the climate.
Last question we have here in the chat is from an iPhone user. Kenza bushels per acre.
Oh man. See, this is where I need my colleague Brandon. I do not think in bushels per acre. Unfortunately, I'm the range of tons per hectare, which is, I'm sorry, was what I think in is very wide, the range. Anywhere from zero point 0.4, which is not a lot, to 1.6, which is still lower than wheat. But again, Kernza is a new domestication, very much a work in progress, and is gaining significant yield potential with every round of selection. So Lee DeHaan estimates that in 10 to 15 years, we would reach annual wheat, potentially that yield. But it's also not that fair to compare it to annual wheat because it is not annual wheat. And there's quite a few other small grains like quinoa that yield quite a bit less, but are economically viable for growers to produce. And Kernza has a dual use forage grain potential as well that helps the economics. But yeah, there's no one number for Kernza yields. Similarly, there's no one number for wheat. Yields of wheat in Kansas are half what they are in Minnesota and a quarter what they are in the UK. And those are all environmental soil differences.
Got some more questions coming in. Annette Kovar asks, do carbon sequestration efforts factor into your efforts?
Absolutely. I mean, the title of this talk was, if you want to regenerate, look at what generated in the first place. And I think it's just so important to recognize that the high carbon soils that we first planted into, that carbon got accumulated under the influence of perennial vegetation. And it's very hard to imagine reaching those same levels of soil carbon any other way than re-establishing perennial vegetation that is putting a lot of the carbon in the ground and it's not disturbing the ground. Those four soil health principles that I listed that the NRCS has outlined perfectly describe what a prairie does and what a perennial perennial diverse agriculture could do. And so, yeah, carbon sequestration is huge. It's not going to solve climate change, but it's also really important that we pull as much carbon out of the atmosphere as we can. And even if we stopped fossil fuel combustion today, there's still too much carbon in the atmosphere that it would be beneficial to reduce, and thus recapturing a bunch of the soil carbon that has been lost as a function of land conversion and agriculture is absolutely a important objective of pursuing perennial agriculture.
Next question is from Janet Poley. Strategy is for telling story in current environment. Who is doing this?
We're telling story in by current environment, are we talking about like the last month, Janet?
Janet, you
I,
can unmute yourself if you want to
I'm not
ask
sure I
that question a little bit
understand.
clearer.
My question really is longer than the last month, but I think the perennial annual story is a wonderful handle for telling the story.
Mhm.
And I'm asking if anybody is in charge of telling that story. I think even here in Nebraska, the front page today of our paper was eliminating somebody from USDA. So there's an opportunity to tell the story. And I just wondered how that is happening.
Yeah, well, it's a good question, Janet. I think it's happening in a somewhat diffuse way, but it is being told in a lot of different venues. We we have there's a slew of both scientific and lay public articles going out all of the time. There's podcasts and Instagram accounts, there's Washington Post articles, there's quite a bit of information, but I understand what you're saying. It's no one person is in charge, that's for sure. There's a lot of communications departments that are making a push to communicate what it is we're talking about here, and I appreciate the point. But we're open to other suggestions also. If
And I'll be happy to
Yeah.
provide some. I've done a lot of this kind of communication. But I think having a bit more communication at the right time in the right place, even a letter tomorrow to the Lincoln Journal Star might be appropriate.
Hmm.
Thank
All
you,
right.
Janet.
Someone might want to write that.
We're going to go to Carol Babcock. Does Land Institute sell kernels of grain to the public?
We don't, but there is an organization called Sustainagrain that we're closely aligned with. And Sustainagrain, I think if you look that up, Sustain Grain online, you will find it. There's also a outlet called Perennial Pantry in Minnesota that sells some kernza as well. It's appeared at Whole Foods and some other larger retail outlets, but it's not super consistent. Here in Salina at Dillon's, which is the Kroger grocery store, you can, or at least until I haven't looked in the last few weeks, but for quite a while, it's been possible to buy Climate Smart cereal, which is Cascadian Farm breakfast cereal. It's pretty good, little sweet, but it's not bad. And it's made out of kernza. So
Priscilla Handy is asking, how much of these perennial crops are intended for direct human consumption? How much for livestock?
yeah, we are very much angling towards direct human consumption almost exclusively, but that's our breeding objectives, and it is possible, it will be possible to use them for livestock. And I should say also that silphium, kernza, and sainfoin are all crops that have very high forage value. And as I mentioned already, that dual use improves on at least the near long-term economics of these crops before yields are what they might need to be to stand alone. And so the grain can be used for livestock and certainly the plant matter, but our breeding work is focused on human consumption.
Christy Harch, I misremember your name, Harchmeyer. What are the neutral benefits of Kernza?
There's many, and there's some good articles, a little bit more on the scientific side of things. But if you go to the Land Institute's website, there's you can look for those articles on currents of nutrition. It's known to have be quite high in protein, and that's in part because it has not grown the endosperm or the kind of starch rich part of the seed. That's when wheat increased in yield, that is the part that bulked up a lot, and it brought the protein content down some. And so Kern's is still quite high in protein relative to wheat, for example. But there's other trace nutrients that are high and other properties. I'm not as familiar with all of that. We have a food scientist now on staff, Evan Crane, who has written quite a bit on the topic, and I would direct you there if you're interested in some more specifics.
Well, Thomas Hochmeyer did some math for us. Yield conversion 0.4 T over HA equals CA 6 BU over A 1.6 equals 24 BU. So I don't know that math, but I'm assuming that may look familiar to you, Tim.
Again, I am a soil ecologist by training, and I have never programmed bushels. You'd think I would, but I haven't. I'm the kilograms per hectare or tons per hectare is the metric units my brain works in. So I thank Thomas for that, and I'm going to ask Brandon, who is the guy who's very involved in Sustainagrain that I just mentioned, and he lives in Nebraska. He has done this calculation, so I'll see if that is what he's come up with too.
Ron Meyer's asking, is carbon capture technology a practical way to reduce global warming?
Well, it is absolutely. And if a lot of acres were planted to any of these perennial crops, it could be significant. Um, it's one of these races that we're having where, we have where carbon dioxide in the atmosphere just is, well, I think we're at 430 plus parts per million now, and 280 is where it was for thousands of years. And so we have no time to wait on the one hand, but if we could achieve some really viable perennial crops in the next 15 years or so, especially with some of the methods that are coming out for advancing the germplasm, um, it would make a major difference. Now, I'm quick to point out that it will not solve climate change, as some folks have tried to make the case for with regenerative agriculture. I think that's a disservice and is not true. It will not pull out as much carbon dioxide as is being emitted in fossil fuels. But so much has gone up into the atmosphere just through land use change, clearing forests, or loss of organic matter, mainly in agriculture, that it could make a difference. There's no question.
Marvin Almy is asking, are any of the big grain merchants like Cargill, Bunge, ADM involved in any of the research on perennials?
What was that question
Are any
again?
of the big grain merchants like
Oh, yeah.
Cargill,
Yeah.
Bunge, ADM involved?
They're perennial curious. We interact with a number of these companies, and they all have kind of an interest, and have wanted to play some role. Although to my knowledge, right now we don't have any. Especially ADM, Cargill. I don't believe that we've had any interaction with. but we don't really have there's not an obvious place right now for that relationship to flourish, although I think there's people having discussions of if they are interested in the grain. General Mills has, they own Cascadian Farms and they have been involved in Kernza and are supportive of it. But we also interact with many smaller entities as well and are not are looking for there not to be a corner on the market by any one company. And there's many European companies that are also very interested, but Kernza has had a difficult time passing their novel food kind of status test. There's many tests actually, and while we're approved in the U.S. with what's called GRAS status, or we're moving forward, generally regarded as safe, is what GRAS stands for. It's a different set of considerations than the EFSA, the European Food and Safety Administration, I think it is, that is holding us up from being able to commercially release Kernza in the EU. And you saw how many dots there are in Europe, and most of them are working in research on Kernza. So it's fascinating to see it being held up for reasons we don't entirely understand at this point. It really does not make sense. And I could talk about that a little bit more, but
Norman has a question. You talked about the cost of controlling unwanted weeds. A number of years ago, an experiment station in South Dakota explored the alternation of cool and warm season grasses to break up
yeah.
weed cycles. Have you explored this approach?
That is the kind of approach we have taken and are interested in exploring further. I can say that there's only at this moment at the Land Institute, Kernza is the one crop that's out and really being evaluated in agronomic terms for things like weed control. The other crops are still very much in a work in progress in the breeding pipeline. And we're just not in the same position to do the experiments like what are being described right there. But that is an ecological approach, that and many others using nurse crops, like an annual nurse crop to sow the perennial into, because oftentimes with these perennial crops, the worst weeds come in the establishment year before they have closed canopy and really start to appropriate the soil resources. That cropping system that I showed with alfalfa and kernza had almost no weeds. I mean, it's just amazing how well it suppressed weeds for 4 years. And it's because those perennials are able to take advantage of sunlight, water, and nutrients so aggressively, but are compatible. The alfalfa has very deep roots. The Kearns has deep roots, but alfalfa is even deeper in terms of how it can access water in particular. So, but yes, I appreciate the question because it underscores exactly the kind of agroecological approach that will be important for suppressing weeds in these systems.
Well, looks like that may be our last question there, Mr. Cruz. Peter?
Uh, yes, Tim, thank you very much. We still have about 10 or so minutes. We can open it up to anybody who would like to unmute and say something directly into their microphone so everybody can hear it, either directly to Tim or in response to one of the other questions or comments, or raise a new point. So feel free to go ahead and make your own contribution right now.
You can unmute. You are all able to unmute yourself.
Tim, this is Carol Babcock. I have attended the Land Institute seminar, I guess you'd say, in September a few years ago. And I wonder if those are still going on and what are the topics that you're addressing at those?
Well, thanks, Carol. I appreciate that. The Prairie Festival happened once after COVID, and it has been put on pause for the last 2 years. And it's partly just in the things got messed up with COVID. And we will be having a Prairie Festival next year in 2026. It will be the 50th anniversary of the Land Institute, and it's going to be a pretty big celebration. Um, Wes is still with us and kicking, and we just need to have. We don't know, at least to my knowledge, I don't know the themes that will be central to that Prairie Festival, but I would keep your eyes open for it. In the near term, there is a film that has been made called Prairie Prophecy on kind of Wes Jackson's influence in the larger conversation around agriculture. And there's going to be a viewing at the Opera House in Salina. That's a beautiful facility in the last weekend of April, I believe it is. You can check our website if anyone wants to come to Salina. And there's going to be quite a few activities around the showing of this movie, a tour of the Land Institute, kind of almost like a little mini Prairie Festival. So if people are interested in that, might look into coming down that in the end of April. But yeah, thank you for that question.
Tim, if one of us were to go to Whole Foods and if they carried Kernza, in what form would it be? Would it be like flakes or kernels or what? And you said it had a little bit of a sweet taste. Could you tell us what it comes closest to of the products that we're familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, it has kind of a nutty flavor to it. Once you know it, you can really pick it out if it's in a loaf. When I was saying it's not suitable to bake bread with, that's on its own, but you can absolutely fold in 20 to up to 50% kernza with wheat flour to make a baked product. At Whole Foods, you're going to see flour, but I believe you also can. I have seen whole grain as well, and that exists at Perennial Pantry, and I believe Sustainagrain. Sustainagrain, which I mentioned again, you can get it online, and Brandon is up there in Nebraska, shipping it out from his place in Nebraska. They have recently made a rolled kernza product, like a rolled oat. It's delicious. I mean, and it's great to make granola with, or as a like oatmeal. We often mix it 50% with steel cut oats and kernza. It's great. So I
And
recommend it.
it doesn't need a sweetener.
Um, I mean, it depends on people's preference. I put in a little bit of honey myself, but it has a natural sweet nuttiness to it. So I think there's some people who would find it just fine as is.
So it could be eaten as oatmeal could, and people could eat it with honey, raisins,
Absolutely.
sugar,
Yeah.
berries, or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Very much.
Okay.
We have time for another question. If you want to unmute yourself, go ahead.
Tim, how has your work, the years that you've spent at the Land Institute, how has your work changed? You started with just a single kernza, and then you guys have added rice and maize and something else. And it's like, how has your particular role changed and developed over these years?
Yeah, well, I did come with multiple hats at the very beginning, even as a soil ecologist, and have worked with Kernza and cropping systems like the intercrop, very focused on figuring out how to have a legume supply the majority or all of the nitrogen requirements of Kernza. That was a big part of my research docket. And that work continues to move forward with Laura Vanderpool, who is the new soil ecologist that did her PhD at Colorado State. and joined us a year and a half ago. But what has ended up happening is quite a bit more focus also on soil carbon, as we've been discussing, understanding how soil carbon accumulates in perennial cropping systems, and how re-establishing, terminating, and replanting affects that stored soil carbon. If you, how much do you lose when you undergo a replacement stand? Questions like that. And then, yeah, there's so many so many questions when it comes to soil ecology and perennials, just because it so dramatically changes the environment of the soil. And it's a place where agriculture just has not gone, grain agriculture, nearly as much. But I also was the research director when I got to the Land Institute, so as an administrative 40% of my position. And then I also direct something called the Perennial Agriculture Project. That's 20% of a position. So I've changed over the years to where now I'm almost all running this international initiative, interacting with researchers from Bolivia to Ukraine, Uganda, Uruguay, Scandinavia, France, just because, if we really are going to influence global agriculture and have a large scale improvement on soil enhancement, curbing soil degradation that is profound right now on the planet. We need more people working on this stuff. There's just no way around it. And so incentivizing what we can do to help. We don't have a lot of funds to stream. We offer some seed grants to some research groups, but we also have seeds, and we have expertise, and we have training opportunities, and we have the ability to connect people in countries with funding sources that are only available in those countries. And so helping them to write grants, and we've been successful. People have been getting funding from regional or national sources outside of the US to carry out this work. And it's very encouraging to see, because like we said, we just had the realization we really need more people working on this, especially in the breeding arena. It takes a while to develop a crop like this. And so the more hands, the faster it's going to happen.
Tim, I have a question. I was quite impressed with that international map of collaboration that you have, but there seems to be a big hole in Southeast Asia.
I was anticipating that. Strangely, we do not have very many colleagues in India, and that's, I think, about to change. At the meeting in Mexico, there's a number of sorghum researchers coming from ICRISAT, which is based in India, and we're excited. And they actually have been working on perennial sorghum, some of them already, and they're just not on the map. But there's obvious room for more involvement in Southeast Asia, and in particular with India. And yeah, I would welcome your guidance if you know of certain individuals that might be interested. But it's on our list. It's a huge uh, it's a huge population that positively should be involved.
So when you have these collaboration, do these people can start on their own based on research publications, or do you actually go in person and help them?
I mean, right now publications matter, but conversations matter a lot too. On Like we're having right now, a lot of Zooms. We're opening up the possibility of exchanges. I mentioned the Bolivian quinoa work. The lead breeder in Bolivia is coming to the Land Institute this summer, to have, and we'll also visit a quinoa breeder in Washington State at Washington State University. We're also involved in helping to orchestrate a PhD for a graduate student who will be working very closely with that Bolivian plant breeder, going to Bolivia and kind of going back and forth. So there's a lot of training involved. That's a wide hybrid cross. It could be kind of technical, and so we have a fair amount of experience in doing that work, and that's again something that we're really happy to share is that expertise to make something happen. So it depends on the circumstances, on the crop, all of these things. There's a Ukrainian Kernza breeder who breeds perennial grasses already, and he started working on Kernza. He is just going to town. It's great. He is one of the best Kernza breeders in the world right now, and just doing it amidst the war, making really good progress. And he didn't need very much help because he was already breeding grasses.
Thank you.
Well, it looks like we've come exactly to the end of our 90 minutes, so I'll take this opportunity again to thank Dr. Tim Cruz for his fascinating talk, his interesting and engaging graphics and nice responses to the questions. So really appreciate your coming here and spending the time. Next week, we have an interesting, somewhat of a unique format. We have a speaker, Dr. John Eichert, who is a retired professor of agricultural economics at the University of Missouri, who's going to speak about sustainable economics. But he's going to only speak for a shorter period of time, and then he's going to engage in a conversation with Chuck Francis, Professor Charles Francis here, retired from the University of Nebraska, who's known sort of as the father of sustainable agriculture in the world and agroecology. So that should provide a fascinating program for us. So tune in next week, Sunday at 7 o'clock. And again, thank you all for participating. And Tim, thanks again for your presentation.
Well, thank you all for spending your Sunday evening learning about this stuff. I really appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you all.
All right. Take care, everyone.